The new principal discovered a document buried in old records. It had 9 names crossed out. Mine wasn't crossed out yet. Dr. Amara Osei called my mother at 6:15 on Thursday morning and told her to bring me to the school immediately. She wouldn't explain why over the phone, just said it was urgent and involved my safety. My mother woke me up with her hand on my shoulder, her face pale, and said we were leaving in 5 minutes. We drove to Whitman Academy in silence. Dr. Osei met us at the main entrance and walked us straight to her office. She'd only been principal for 6 weeks, hired after Principal Langford retired suddenly over the summer. She closed the door behind us and placed a plastic evidence bag on her desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, with 10 names written in blue ink. 9 of them had thick black lines crossed through them. The 10th name was mine, Julian Cross. No cross-out mark. Just my name sitting there at the bottom of the list like an appointment that hadn't been kept yet. Dr. Osei said she'd found it yesterday afternoon while going through filing cabinets in the basement storage room, tucked inside a folder labeled Student Services 2015-2019. She'd been looking for old attendance records to understand enrollment patterns. Instead, she found this. My mother asked what the other names were. Dr. Osei read them aloud. Simone Blackwell, Wesley Huang, Destiny Lawson, Amir Patel, Chloe Williams, Trevor Park, Jasmine Rodriguez, Kenji Tanaka, David Morrison. I recognized every single one. They'd all been students at Whitman Academy. They were all dead now. Simone Blackwell died in 2016, junior year, drove her car into a concrete barrier on Route 9 at 3 in the morning. The police called it a single-vehicle accident, possible fatigue or distraction. Wesley Huang died in 2017, senior year, overdose in his dorm room 3 weeks into his first semester at college. Destiny Lawson died in 2018, a year after graduation, fell from the roof of her apartment building during what friends described as a mental health crisis. Amir Patel died in 2019, 2 years out of high school, walked into traffic on a busy street in broad daylight. Witnesses said he didn't even look before stepping off the curb. Chloe Williams died in 2016, same year as Simone, found in her bathtub with her wrist slit. Trevor Park died in 2017, hanged himself in his parents' garage. Jasmine Rodriguez died in 2018, took every pill in her mother's medicine cabinet. Kenji Tanaka died in 2019, jumped from a bridge. David Morrison died in 2020, shot himself in his childhood bedroom. 9 deaths over 5 years, all ruled suicides or accidents, all former Whitman Academy students, all on this list. And then my name, untouched, waiting. Dr. Osei said she'd called the police the moment she found the document. They were sending detectives this morning. She'd also called an emergency meeting with the school board, but she wanted my mother and me to see. At first, because whatever this list meant, I was in immediate danger. My mother's hand found mine, and squeezed so hard my fingers went numb. She asked the question I couldn't form words around. Who wrote this? Dr. Osei said there was no signature, no date, nothing to identify the author, but the handwriting was distinctive, careful block letters written with a steady hand. Someone had made this list deliberately. Someone had crossed out 9 names as those students died. Someone was waiting to cross out mine. The police arrived at 7:30, 2 detectives named Franklin and Liu, who looked at the document for a long time without speaking. Detective Franklin was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. Detective Liu was younger, sharp-featured, and intense. She asked me if I'd known all 9 deceased students. I said yes. She asked how well. I told her some of them had been close friends. Simone and I had been on the debate team together. Wesley was in my AP chemistry class. Destiny and I played volleyball. The others I'd known less well, but we'd all been part of the same social circles, attended the same parties, eaten lunch in the same areas. Detective Liu wrote everything down. She asked if we'd all been in the same grade. I said no, we'd spanned 3 different graduating classes from 2016 to 2019. She asked what else we had in common. I started to say I didn't know, but then I stopped because that wasn't true. There was something. We'd all been part of the peer counseling program. Whitman Academy had a student-run peer counseling system where upperclassmen were trained to provide support to struggling students. It was run by the school psychologist Dr. Nathan Kerrigan, who'd been at Whitman for over 20 years. All 9 dead students had been peer counselors. So was I. I told the detectives this and watched their expressions change. Detective Franklin asked when I joined the program. I said freshman year, 2018. He asked if I was still active. I said yes. I was now a senior and one of the program leaders. Detective Liu asked who else was currently in the program. I gave them 5 names. She wrote them all down and asked if any of them were acting strangely or seemed threatened. I said no, but even as I spoke, I realized how little I actually knew about what was happening in their lives. We met twice a week for group sessions, but those were structured and supervised. We didn't talk about real things there. My mother interrupted to ask what the police were going to do to protect me. Detective Franklin said they were taking the threat seriously and would assign patrol units to watch our house and the school. He said they'd be investigating everyone connected to the peer counseling program, starting with Dr. Kerrigan. He said I should not go anywhere alone and should report anything unusual immediately. Then he looked at me with an expression that made my stomach turn over and asked if Dr. Kerrigan had ever made me uncomfortable. The question hung in the air. My mother's grip tightened on my hand again. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell them Dr. Kerrigan was professional and appropriate and had never crossed any lines, but that would have been a lie. Dr. Kerrigan made everyone uncomfortable. He had a way of looking at students that lasted too long, asking questions that felt invasive, touching shoulders and backs during conversations. Nothing you could report, nothing concrete enough to point to, just a persistent feeling that something was wrong. I'd mentioned it to my faculty advisor last year, and she'd told me Dr. Kerrigan had an unconventional approach, but was highly respected in his field. She'd made me feel like I was the problem for noticing. I told the detectives all of this. Detective Liu stopped writing and looked up at me. She asked if any of the 9 dead students had ever complained about Dr. Kerrigan. I said I didn't know. She asked if I'd ever witnessed him being inappropriate with any of them. I thought back to group sessions, to the times I'd seen Simone flinch when Dr. Kerrigan stood behind her chair, to the way Wesley would go quiet whenever Dr. Kerrigan asked about his home life, to how Destiny had quit the program suddenly sophomore year and wouldn't explain why. I told the detectives yes, I'd seen things that seemed off. Detective Franklin stood up and said they needed to speak with Dr. Kerrigan immediately. Dr. Osei called Dr. Kerrigan at 8 Sao and asked him to come to the school. He arrived 20 minutes later, walking into the main office with his usual confident stride, dressed in the expensive suits he always wore, his silver hair perfectly styled. He smiled when he saw Dr. Osei, that warm, professional smile he used with everyone. Then he saw the detectives, and the smile faltered. Dr. Osei showed him the list. I watched his face from where I sat in the corner of the office, watched the way his eyes moved across each name, the way his jaw tightened when he reached mine. He said he didn't know anything about this document, had never seen it before, couldn't imagine who would create something so disturbing. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. They trembled slightly as he handed the evidence bag back to Dr. Osei. Detective Liu asked him about the peer counseling program. He explained that he'd founded it in 2004, that it provided crucial support to students dealing with stress, family issues, academic pressure, and mental health challenges. He said all peer counselors underwent extensive training in confidentiality, active listening, and crisis intervention. He said the program had helped hundreds of students over the years. Detective Franklin asked if all 9 deceased students had been in the program. Dr. Kerrigan said yes, they had. Detective Franklin asked if that seemed unusual to him. 9 suicides from a pool of, maybe 60 total peer counselors over those years? Dr. Kerrigan said mental health work was difficult, and peer counselors often came from backgrounds where they'd experienced their own struggles. They were drawn to helping others because they understood pain. Sometimes that pain caught up with them, despite everyone's best efforts. His answer was smooth, rehearsed, the kind of response he'd probably given to parents and administrators dozens of times. But Detective Liu wasn't buying it. She asked him directly if he'd ever had inappropriate contact with any student in the program. He looked at her with what seemed like genuine shock and said absolutely not. His relationships with students were strictly professional. He'd never crossed ethical boundaries. Detective Liu asked if anyone had ever accused him of misconduct. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying no. That hesitation was enough. Dr. Osei sent me home with my mother while the police continued questioning Dr. Kerrigan. We drove back in the same heavy silence, but now it felt different, loaded with information we didn't know how to process. My mother kept looking at me like she was checking to make sure I was still solid, still real. When we got home, she made me sit at the kitchen table while she called my aunt, my grandmother, my father's brother, spreading the news through the family in hushed, urgent tones. I sat there listening to her repeat the same information over and over. 9 names crossed out, mine still waiting, police investigating. Nobody knows who made the list. My phone started buzzing with texts from other students at Whitman. Word was spreading fast. Someone had leaked that police were at the school, questioning Dr. Kerrigan. The rumors were already multiplying and mutating. By noon, 3 different people had texted me, asking if Dr. Kerrigan had molested me. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and started searching for information about the 9 dead students. Most of them had obituaries online, brief paragraphs about their lives cut short, survived by parents and siblings and friends. A few had memorial pages on social media, where people had posted photos and memories. I scrolled through images of Simone at debate tournaments, Wesley in his chemistry lab goggles, Destiny spiking a volleyball, all of them smiling and alive and unaware of what was coming. I looked for patterns, connections, anything that might explain why their names were on that list. What I found was absence. None of them had left suicide notes. None of them had shown obvious warning signs according to their friends and family. They'd all died suddenly, unexpectedly, without explanation. That was the first pattern. The second pattern was timing. They'd all died during or shortly after being active in the peer counseling program. The third pattern was more subtle. In the memorial comments, several people mentioned that the deceased had been going through something, or seemed stressed about school in the weeks before they died. When I cross-referenced the dates, I realized they'd all died within a month of the spring semester ending, May or June, every single one, right after final exams. I called Destiny's younger sister Monica, who was a sophomore at Whitman now. We'd stayed in touch after Destiny died, checking in on each other occasionally. Monica answered on the third ring. I asked her if Destiny had ever mentioned Dr. Kerrigan before she died. Monica was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Destiny had quit peer counseling in the middle of sophomore year because Dr. Kerrigan made her uncomfortable. She'd never elaborated, but Monica remembered her saying something about private sessions that felt wrong. I asked if Destiny had reported it. Monica said she didn't think so. Destiny had been afraid no one would believe her. Dr. Kerrigan was too respected, too established. She'd just quietly dropped out of the program and tried to move on. But she'd never been the same after. She'd become anxious, withdrawn, stopped hanging out with friends. By the time she graduated, she was barely functional. Monica's voice cracked when she said Destiny's death hadn't felt like a suicide to her. It felt like something had been taken from her sister long before she jumped. I thanked Monica and hung up. Then I called Trevor Park's older brother Daniel. He picked up immediately, and before I could even explain why I was calling, he said he'd been waiting for this call for 3 years. He said Trevor had told him things before he died, things about Dr. Kerrigan that Daniel had reported to the school and the police and anyone who would listen. But nobody had taken him seriously. They'd written him off as a grieving brother looking for someone to blame. Daniel said Trevor had been part of a special program within peer counseling, an advanced group that met privately with Dr. Kerrigan for additional training. Trevor had been excited about it at first. He'd felt chosen, special. But then, the sessions started getting strange. Dr. Kerrigan would ask invasive questions about their personal lives, their relationships, their deepest fears and secrets. He'd record everything. He'd make them do trust exercises that involved physical contact. Trevor had wanted to quit, but Dr. Kerrigan told him that leaving would hurt his college applications. Dr. Kerrigan wrote all the recommendation letters for peer counselors. Trevor felt trapped. Daniel said his brother started having panic attacks that spring. He stopped sleeping. He told Daniel that Dr. Kerrigan knew things about him that no one should know and was using that information to manipulate him. A week later, Trevor hanged himself in the garage. Daniel had told all of this to the police. They'd interviewed Dr. Kerrigan, who explained that Trevor had been dealing with depression and academic stress. The school had backed Dr. Kerrigan completely. The case was closed as a suicide. No further investigation. Daniel's voice was shaking with rage when he told me all of this. He said he'd been waiting for someone to finally believe him. I told him about the list. He went completely silent. Then he said it was exactly what he'd suspected all along. Dr. Kerrigan was hunting them. The police called my mother at 3 hours that afternoon. Detective Liu said they'd obtained a warrant to search Dr. Kerrigan's office and home. They'd found extensive records that raised serious concerns. She asked if we could come back to the station to provide a formal statement. We drove there in the middle of afternoon traffic, my mother gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. At the police station, we were led to an interview room where Detective Liu and Detective Franklin were waiting with file boxes stacked on the table. Detective Liu said they'd found detailed files on every peer counselor from the past 15 years. Dr. Kerrigan had kept notes on their personal lives, their vulnerabilities, their family situations, their psychological weaknesses. He documented things students had told him in confidence and used that information to maintain control over them. The files were organized by year and color-coded by some system the detectives were still trying to understand. Red folders seemed to indicate students Dr. Kerrigan had designated as high priority. All 9 deceased students had red folders. So did I. Detective Franklin opened my folder and I saw pages of notes in Dr. Kerrigan's handwriting. Detailed observations about my behavior, my relationships, my emotional state. Notes about my father's death 2 years ago and how I'd coped with grief. Notes about arguments I'd had with my mother that I'd never told anyone about. Notes about a girl I'd liked and how she'd rejected me. Notes about my fears of not being good enough, not being smart enough, not mattering. Every weakness I'd ever revealed in peer counseling sessions was documented and analyzed. At the bottom of the most recent page, dated 3 weeks ago, Dr. Kerrigan had written a single sentence in red ink. JC is ready. Initiate final protocol after winter exams. I stared at those words until they stopped making sense. Ready for what? What protocol? Detective Liu said they were still analyzing the documents, but it appeared Dr. Kerrigan had been systematically identifying vulnerable students and pushing them toward psychological breaking points. The detectives had found references to something called controlled crisis intervention in his notes. It seemed to be a methodology he'd developed himself, not based on any legitimate therapeutic practice. The theory, as far as they could determine, was that certain students needed to experience complete psychological collapse in order to rebuild themselves stronger. Dr. Kerrigan believed he was helping them by engineering their breakdowns. Except the 9 students who'd died hadn't rebuilt. They'd just broken. My mother asked how this could have gone on for so long without anyone noticing. Detective Franklin said institutional protections. Dr. Kerrigan had been at Whitman Academy for over 20 years. He'd built relationships with administrators, school board members, wealthy donors. He'd published papers on adolescent psychology. He'd won awards for his peer counseling program. When complaints surfaced, they were quietly dismissed or buried. The school had protected him because his program brought prestige, and because investigating him would have meant acknowledging they'd let a predator operate unchecked for 2 decades. Detective Liu added that they'd found evidence Dr. Kerrigan had been manipulating students in other ways too. He'd convinced some of them to isolate themselves from friends and family. He'd persuaded others to share secrets that he then used as leverage. He'd created dependence, making students believe they couldn't function without his guidance. Several of the Red Folder students had been seeing Dr. Kerrigan for private sessions outside of school hours, sessions that weren't documented anywhere in official records. Those sessions appeared to be where the worst manipulation occurred. I asked if the detectives thought Dr. Kerrigan had directly caused the 9 deaths. Detective Franklin said they couldn't prove he'd physically harmed anyone, but they believed he'd psychologically engineered situations that led to their suicides. He'd isolated them, destabilized them, and then withdrawn support at critical moments. He'd essentially weaponized their trust in him. It wasn't murder in the legal sense, but it was something close, something deliberate and calculated. Detective Liu said they were building a case, but it would be difficult. Most of the evidence was circumstantial. The files proved unethical behavior, but not criminal intent. Unless they could find direct proof that Dr. Kerrigan had intended to cause harm, the most they might be able to charge him with was professional misconduct. He'd lose his license, but he wouldn't go to prison. My mother slammed her hand on the table and said that wasn't good enough. 9 children were dead. Her son was next on his list. There had to be something they could do. Detective Franklin said there was. They needed someone on the inside, someone who could document Dr. Kerrigan's methods in real time, someone he still trusted. He looked at me when he said it. The plan was dangerous and possibly illegal, and definitely something no 17-year-old should be asked to do, but I agreed immediately. Detective Liu said they'd wire me with a recording device and have me continue attending peer counseling sessions as normal. They wanted me to get Dr. Kerrigan talking about his methods, about the students who'd died, about what he'd meant by final protocol. If I could get him to admit on tape that he'd intentionally harmed students, they'd have grounds for criminal charges. My mother refused at first, said absolutely not, no way was she letting her son anywhere near that man. But I told her I had to do this. For Simone and Wesley and Destiny and all the others whose names were crossed out. For Daniel Park, who'd been screaming the truth for 3 years while everyone ignored him. For every student who was still in that program thinking they were being helped while they were actually being hunted. My mother cried, but eventually she nodded. The next morning, I went back to Whitman Academy for the first time since learning about the list. Word had spread that Dr. Kerrigan was under investigation. Groups of students stood in hallways whispering. Some looked scared. Others looked vindicated, like they'd known something was wrong all along but hadn't been able to name it. Dr. Osi had called an assembly for second period to address the situation. She stood on the auditorium stage and told us that a personnel matter was being investigated and counseling resources were available for anyone who needed support. She didn't mention Dr. Kerrigan by name, but everyone knew. After the assembly, I went to the peer counseling office. Dr. Kerrigan was there, sitting at his desk like nothing had changed. He smiled when he saw me. That same warm, professional smile. He asked how I was holding up with everything that was happening. I sat down across from him, feeling the recording device taped to my chest under my shirt, and told him I was confused and scared. He nodded sympathetically and said, that was understandable. He said there had been a misunderstanding, but it would all be resolved soon. He said the important thing was to focus on supporting each other through this difficult time. His voice was calm and soothing, the voice he'd used in hundreds of counseling sessions, the voice that had convinced vulnerable students to trust him with their deepest pain. I asked him about the list, told him the police had shown it to me, told him my name was on it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the list wasn't what it looked like. He said he'd created it years ago as a way to track students who were at highest risk. The crossed-out names weren't targets. They were students he'd failed to save. He'd marked them after they died as a reminder of his responsibility. My name was on there because he recognized I was struggling and wanted to make sure he didn't fail me too. It was a plausible explanation. It might have even been convincing if I didn't know about the red folders and the notes about final protocol and the pattern of deaths all occurring right after spring exams. I asked him what he meant by final protocol. He blinked, surprised I knew the term. Then his expression shifted, became more guarded. He asked where I'd heard that phrase. I told him the police had mentioned it when they questioned me. He studied my face for a long moment, his eyes moving across my features like he was reading information written on my skin. Then he said the final protocol was the last stage of therapeutic intervention. It was when a student had processed their trauma fully and was ready to move forward without support. It was graduation from the counseling program, essentially. A successful outcome. I asked why it had to happen after winter exams specifically. He said timing was important in psychological work. Major academic milestones created natural transition points. Students needed to prove to themselves they could handle pressure before moving on. I asked if Simone had completed the final protocol. He said yes. I asked if Wesley had. He said yes. I went through all 9 names, asking the same question each time, and every time he said yes. They'd all successfully completed the protocol, They'd all graduated from counseling. They'd all died within weeks of that graduation. I asked him how that made sense. If they'd successfully processed their trauma and moved forward, why did they all kill themselves right after? His smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. He said mental health was complicated. Sometimes people hid their true struggles. Sometimes therapeutic success triggered unexpected reactions. Sometimes the timing was just tragic coincidence. He said he'd spent years questioning whether he could have done more, but ultimately people made their own choices. He couldn't control what they did after leaving his care. The recording device captured every word, his tone, his deflections, his careful non-answers. It wasn't a confession, but it was something. Proof that he'd known all 9 students had died shortly after completing his special protocol and hadn't found that pattern concerning enough to investigate or change his methods. I pushed harder, asked him what specifically the final protocol involved. He said it was individualized for each student, tailored to their specific needs. I asked what mine would involve. He leaned back in his chair and studied me again with those cold, analytical eyes. He said I'd been making excellent progress. I'd opened up about my father's death and the guilt I carried about not being there when he had his heart attack. I'd shared my fears about not living up to his memory. I'd talked about feeling invisible at school, like nobody really saw the real me. Those were all important breakthroughs. The final protocol would involve confronting the core fear underneath all of that. The fear that I didn't matter, that my life had no real impact. He said sometimes students needed to experience that fear fully, stare into the void of meaninglessness before they could build authentic purpose. He said it would be difficult but transformative. He said he'd guide me through it when the time came. After winter exams, probably. I felt sick listening to him describe dismantling someone's will to live as therapeutic intervention. This was what he'd done to the others. Convinced them they needed to experience complete psychological destruction to heal. Led them to the edge of the abyss, and then let them fall. I asked him what happened if someone couldn't handle it. He said they always could. He'd never had a student fail the protocol. That's when I understood. The 9 dead students hadn't failed. They'd succeeded exactly as planned. I left Dr. Kerrigan's office and went straight to the bathroom where I threw up. Then I texted Detective Liu and told her I had the recording. She said to meet her off campus. I told my mother I was going to study at the library and drove to a coffee shop 3 miles from school where Detective Liu was waiting in an unmarked car. I handed her the recording device, and she listened to the entire conversation through headphones, her expression getting harder with each minute. When it finished, she said it was good, but not enough for criminal charges. Dr. Kerrigan hadn't admitted to intending harm. He'd framed everything as legitimate therapy that had tragic unintended outcomes. A good defense attorney would argue he was a dedicated counselor whose experimental methods sometimes failed despite best intentions. We needed more. Something that proved he knew the protocol would cause harm and did it anyway. Detective Liu said they were continuing to analyze the files from his office. They'd found references to a research study Dr. Kerrigan had been conducting without institutional approval or ethics oversight. He'd been documenting the psychological effects of controlled trauma exposure on adolescents. The 9 dead students appeared to be his test subjects. If they could prove he'd been conducting unauthorized human experimentation, they'd have grounds for criminal charges. But the research documentation was coded and incomplete. They needed someone who understood his methodology from the inside. I said I'd go back, get him to explain more. Detective Liu said no, it was too dangerous. If Dr. Kerrigan suspected I was recording him, he might accelerate whatever he'd planned for me. But I insisted. I was already on the list. My name was still uncrossed. He was going to come for me eventually, whether I gathered evidence or not. At least this way, I could fight back. Detective Liu made me promise to be careful. She gave me a new recording device, smaller and harder to detect. She said to wear it at all times. She said if anything felt wrong, if Dr. Kerrigan did or said anything threatening, I should leave immediately and call 911. I promised her I would. I was lying. I knew what I had to do. That night, I searched through the boxes of files my father had left behind when he died. He'd been a lawyer, specialized in civil rights cases. He'd taught me how to document evidence, how to build narratives that courts couldn't ignore. I found his old voice recorder, the one he'd used for client interviews. I tested it to make sure it still worked. Then, I made my plan. The next peer counseling session was scheduled for Monday afternoon. The other student leaders and I were supposed to meet with Dr. Kerrigan to discuss how to support the general peer counselor population through the current crisis. I arrived early and found Dr. Kerrigan alone in his office. He seemed pleased to see me, said he was glad I was handling everything so well, said not everyone had my strength. I told him I'd been thinking about what he said about the final protocol, about confronting core fears. I said I wanted to start early. I didn't want to wait until after exams. I wanted to begin now. He looked surprised, but also gratified. He said most students avoided the difficult work. The fact that I was seeking it out showed real maturity. He asked what had changed my mind. I told him the truth, or a version of it. I said finding out my name was on the list had forced me to confront my own mortality, made me realize I'd been living small and scared. My father had died suddenly without warning, and I'd spent 2 years being paralyzed by the fear of the same thing happening to me. But that fear was stopping me from really living. I wanted to face it. I wanted to feel the full weight of my own insignificance and come out the other side. Dr. Kerrigan's eyes lit up. This was exactly what he wanted to hear. He said we could start immediately. He closed the door to his office and told me to sit on the floor, not in the chair. He sat across from me, close enough that our knees almost touched. He said the first step was radical honesty. I needed to tell him the darkest thought I'd ever had, the thing I was most ashamed of, the secret I'd never told anyone. I thought about what would be believable, what would feed into the narrative he'd constructed about me. I told him that sometimes I was glad my father died, that his expectations had been crushing and now I was free from them, that I felt guilty for feeling relieved. Dr. Kerrigan nodded and said that was good, that was real. He said guilt was a poison we carried, and the only way to neutralize it was to fully acknowledge the selfishness underneath it. He told me to say it again. Say I was glad my father was dead. I said it. He told me to say it louder. I did. He told me to close my eyes and imagine my father hearing me say those words. Imagine the disappointment on his face. Imagine him turning away from me. I felt tears start, but I didn't open my eyes. Dr. Kerrigan's voice kept going, telling me to sit with that image, feel the abandonment, accept that I was alone, that everyone I loved would eventually leave or die, and I'd be left with nothing, that this was the truth of existence, and I needed to embrace it. His voice was hypnotic, relentless. This was how he did it. This was how he broke them down. Hours of this, days, weeks, until students believed they were worthless and alone, until suicide seemed like relief. I let him continue for 20 minutes, let him think he was getting through to me, let him document my responses because I knew he was taking notes somehow, recording this for his research. Then I opened my eyes and looked at him and asked him a question. I asked him how many students he'd done this with. He smiled and said every student was different, but the core methodology was consistent. I asked him how many had died. His smile faltered slightly. He said therapeutic risk was inherent in deep psychological work. I asked him if he'd known they would die when he started the protocol. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, death wasn't the failure. Continued suffering was the failure. The students who died had been in profound pain. He'd offered them a path to transcendence. Some of them took that path by ending their suffering permanently. That wasn't tragedy. That was resolution. He actually believed it. He'd convinced himself that driving students to suicide was a form of mercy, that he was releasing them from pain they couldn't otherwise escape. The psychological manipulation was so profound, he'd lost track of reality. Or maybe he'd never had it to begin with. I asked him if he planned to release me from suffering too. He looked at me with something that might have been affection, and said only if that's what I ultimately needed. He said he'd guide me to my authentic answer. If that answer was continued life, wonderful. If that answer was peaceful exit, that was valid too. His role wasn't to choose for me. It was to strip away all the lies and defenses until only truth remained. I asked him what the list meant then. Why cross out the names? He said it was documentation, a record of students who'd reached final resolution, 9 so far. He hoped there wouldn't be a 10th, but he'd learned not to impose his own preferences onto the process. I asked him if he'd reported any of the deaths as connected. He said no. Each student's resolution was private, confidential. He couldn't violate that trust even after death. I felt the recorder burning against my chest. I had everything. His admission that he'd known students might die from his protocol and continued anyway. His description of suicide as resolution and peaceful exit. His acknowledgement that he'd hidden the pattern of deaths from authorities. His belief that he was helping them by leading them to kill themselves. This wasn't unintended consequences of experimental therapy. This was deliberate. This was murder disguised as treatment. I stood up and told Dr. Kerrigan I needed to think about everything he'd said. He nodded approvingly and said that was wise. He said we'd continue our sessions this week. Daily sessions from now on to prepare for the final protocol. He said he was proud of me for being brave enough to seek truth. I walked out of his office and made it to the parking lot before my legs gave out. I sat in my car shaking for 10 minutes before I could drive. I went straight to the police station. Detective Liu and Detective Franklin listened to the recording 3 times. Then they called the district attorney. By 6 p.m., they had an arrest warrant. They picked up Dr. Kerrigan at his home that evening. He was still dressed in one of his expensive suits, still maintaining that calm, professional demeanor. He insisted this was all a misunderstanding. He'd devoted his life to helping young people. When they played him the recording of our session, he went pale but continued insisting his methods were legitimate therapeutic intervention. The district attorney charged him with 9 counts of manslaughter through reckless endangerment, practicing medicine without proper oversight, conducting unauthorized human experimentation on minors, and child abuse. The charges didn't capture the full horror of what he'd done, but they were enough to ensure he'd face trial. The news broke that night. By morning, it was national. Prestigious schools counselor arrested in connection with 9 student deaths. The media descended on Whitman Academy. Reporters interviewed students, parents, faculty. Everyone had an opinion. Some people defended Dr. Kerrigan, said he'd helped their children through difficult times, insisted the charges were overblown. Others came forward with stories of manipulation and abuse that had gone unreported for years. The peer counseling program was immediately shut down. Dr. Osei launched an independent investigation into how the school had failed to identify and stop Dr. Kerrigan's predatory behavior for over 2 decades. 3 administrators resigned. The school board fired 2 more. Parents filed lawsuits. Students organized protests demanding accountability. Whitman Academy's reputation collapsed overnight. Daniel Park called me the day after the arrest. He cried on the phone for 5 minutes before he could speak. He said thank you over and over, said he'd spent 3 years thinking he was crazy for believing his brother had been murdered. Now people finally understood. Monica called too. So did family members of the other victims. They all said the same thing. Justice was finally possible. The trial took 6 months to reach court. Dr. Kerrigan's defense team argued that his therapeutic methods were unconventional but not criminal. They presented expert witnesses who testified about the risks inherent in treating suicidal adolescents. They said the deaths were tragic, but not his fault. Correlation wasn't causation. But the prosecution had the recording. They had Dr. Kerrigan's own words describing suicide as resolution and peaceful exit. They had his files documenting how he'd systematically isolated and destabilized vulnerable students. They had testimony from survivors who described his manipulation tactics. They had the pattern of 9 deaths, all occurring within weeks of completing his final protocol. Most damning, they had recovered deleted files from Dr. Kerrigan's computer showing his actual research documentation. He'd been tracking psychological deterioration markers in his subjects. He'd noted which interventions produced the most severe dissociation and hopelessness. He'd theorized that some personalities required complete ego death before reconstruction was possible. He'd written about acceptable losses in the pursuit of therapeutic breakthrough. The files proved he'd known his methods were dangerous and had continued anyway. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 40 years in prison. Dr. Kerrigan maintained his innocence even at sentencing, said history would vindicate his work, said he'd been trying to help children no one else could reach, said he'd given them the courage to make authentic choices about their lives. The judge told him he'd given them trauma disguised as therapy and called it healing, told him he'd weaponized trust and called it guidance, told him he was a predator who'd hidden behind credentials and institutional protection while destroying young lives. The families of the 9 victims attended sentencing. Some of them spoke about their children, about the bright futures that had been stolen. Simone's mother talked about finding her daughter's body. Wesley's father described cleaning out his son's dorm room. Destiny's sister Monica read a letter Destiny had written but never sent, describing her fear of Dr. Kerrigan and her certainty that no one would believe her. By the time Monica finished reading, everyone in the courtroom was crying. Dr. Kerrigan was led away in handcuffs. I watched him go and felt nothing like satisfaction. 9 people were still dead. Families were still broken. Students were still traumatized. Justice in a courtroom didn't undo the damage. It just made sure the person responsible couldn't hurt anyone else. Whitman Academy implemented new protocols, mandatory training for all staff on recognizing abuse, independent oversight of counseling programs, anonymous reporting systems. Dr. Osei stayed on as principal and spent 2 years rebuilding trust. I graduated and went to college to study psychology. I wanted to understand how someone like Dr. Kerrigan could exist in a system designed to protect children. I wanted to make sure no one else fell through the cracks the way my friends had. 5 years after the trial, I received a letter from Dr. Kerrigan. He'd written from prison asking me to visit him. He said he wanted to explain his work properly, help me understand what he'd been trying to accomplish. He said I was the only one who'd truly seen his methods and might appreciate their elegance. I threw the letter away without responding. Some people don't deserve explanations or closure. Some people just deserve to be forgotten. The list still exists somewhere in an evidence box. 10 names, 9 crossed out. My name untouched at the bottom. Sometimes I think about how close I came to being number 10. How easy it would have been to believe Dr. Kerrigan's manipulation, to accept his framework of suffering and resolution, to step off whatever edge he was leading me toward. I think about Simone, and Wesley, and Destiny, and the others who didn't make it, who trusted someone who presented himself as a helper and found out too late that he was a hunter. Their names are engraved on a memorial outside Whitman Academy now, a reminder that institutions must protect the vulnerable, that credentials don't guarantee character, that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who convince everyone they're heroes. I visit the memorial every year on the anniversary of Dr. Kerrigan's arrest. I read each name aloud. I tell them someone finally listened. I tell them it mattered. I tell them I'm sorry it took so long. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.